Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Restricted Handling Podcast. As always, you've got myself, Ryan Fugit, former Army aviator, former CIA officer, joined as always by our illustrious co-host, Glenn Korn, who spent 34 years in the U.S. government, most of that at CIA. A strong focus on Russia, which is the topic of conversation today. And Glenn, for months, has been insisting that we get a person that I thought may have been made up for so long, Nataliya, on board to talk specifically about cognitive warfare as it relates to Russia, obviously with Ukraine. And Nataliya Bugayova is a non-resident fellow at the Institute for the Study of War, focusing on Kremlin decision-making, Russian cognitive warfare, but also leads intelligence at Babel Street, an AI threat intel firm. She's written about Russian cognitive warfare and just released a new piece on November 16th on ISW titled Seizing the Initiative Against Russia and Putting the United States in Control. We will have links to both of these articles in the show notes so you can dig in. I personally really appreciated reading them. If you listen to this show, you'll probably really enjoy them. She's also testified in the US and Europe, which I wish on no person, worked on reforms in Ukraine in 2014, and regularly returns to Ukraine to advise and support. I will say, Nataliya, as I mentioned when we were preparing, that I am deeply impressed with what you helped stand up at ISW. It's part of my daily reading. So thank you for that contribution and all you do for Ukraine. Welcome to the show.
It's great to be here.
We are recording on Friday, November 21st in the evening. And I say that because we've just recently heard about this 28-point peace plan that the US and Russia have pulled together. Glenn, before we jump into the cognitive warfare discussion, I was hoping you could just talk through some of the high points of that plan and get your take. And then Nataliya would love to get yours.
Sure, Ryan. Let me add one. Nataliya not only is doing a tremendous amount for Ukraine, but for the United States as well. Maybe even more for the United States in the long run. By the way, we usually start the podcast by saying, welcome, freedom-loving people.
That's right.
It's a very important topic tonight when we talk about freedom, because that's what's at stake here. The high points of this plan, let me just go through point by point, because there's been a lot of discussion in the media. I don't think most of the details are being discussed. Only certain points are being talked about or highlighted in some of the media. So bear with me here. I'll try and go through quickly, and then I'd love to talk about it with Nataliya and you, Ryan. But first, for the 28-point plan, which when I looked it up on the internet, it came up as the Witkoff plan. That was what OAI called it. So it called for an immediate ceasefire. As part of the ceasefire agreement, Russia would get Crimea, Donetsk, and Lugansk, including parts of Donetsk that are still being fought for by the Ukrainians, still being held on to, that the Russians have been unable to take using military force for 2 years. And that my understanding is those areas would not be occupied by Russian troops. As part of the agreement, there'd be like a neutral zone. At least my understanding is from the reading of what I saw on the internet, the areas that the Ukrainians would cede now to the Russians. A freeze in the front lines in Kherson and Sabotage. Ukraine would have to accept that it would cap its military at 600,000 troops. Right now, or as of April, President Zelensky claimed that the Ukrainian armed forces were 880,000 approximately troops. So you're looking at about 300,000 less troops. Now what we don't know is that's active duty troops. Reserves, that's another issue. We probably have to dig into that and get some clarification. This is a hard one, that Ukraine could not join NATO. So these are the NATO countries. Ukraine would have to amend its constitution to say that it would not join NATO. That's a stretch of a demand, in my opinion, to ask another country to change its constitution. There would be no NATO troops stationed on Ukrainian soil. Russia would agree not to reinvade or Ukraine again or launch a new war or against its bordering states. So I assume that means all the countries which are bordering Russia, including Georgia, countries that are not just in Europe. Of course, the Baltics, it's very important. Ukraine can join the EU, so there's no objection to that. The U.S. would provide security guarantees to Ukraine, which would include a decisive, coordinated military response to any future Russian aggression against Ukraine. That's not clearly defined on what that response would be. Part of the agreement is that the U.S. and I guess the EU would phase out certain sanctions on Russia over time. And I'm assessing that would mean that if Russia followed through on its agreement to stop its attacks on Ukraine, then over time, the sanctions that started in 2014 would be rolled back. And of course, if Russia violated any of the agreement in the future, then the sanctions would be reapplied. Ukraine, important point here, there would be an economic recovery plan for Ukraine, which would include investment, reconstruction of Ukrainian cities that have been attacked relentlessly by the Russians. There'd be $100 billion U.S. Fund that would be released using the Russian funds that have been seized to date or frozen. That would go to the Ukraine, and then another $100 billion would come from Europe for the reconstruction of Ukraine. The Ukrainian government would have to hold elections within 100 days of the ceasefire, I guess, that would be the when the clock would start ticking. Russia would rejoin the G8. There would be a peace council created, and the head of the peace council would be President Trump, and the peace council's job would be to monitor the ceasefire. Let's see what else we have. Russia would sign a non-aggression pact with NATO, Russia, and Ukraine. There would also be a resumption of the Russia-NATO security dialogue, extension of arms control treaties already in place between the U.S. and Russia would be barred from blocking any commercial traffic on the Dnieper River. So the Ukrainians would have freedom of navigation on the river. So those are some of the key points that I picked up. And obviously, there's a lot of detail that needs to be worked out. I'm sure a lot of people have a lot of questions about a lot of these things. And in my own assessment, a lot of these points are very ambiguous. And there's a lot of room for debate and interpretation, which is always tricky when you're talking about negotiations for peace and the territory of another country. So on that point, over to you guys.
Talia, would love to hear. Obviously, we're here to talk about cognitive warfare. I would imagine that what we're hearing in this plan is part of a larger effort that's been underway for years, as you've written about. But I just would love to get your take, and please take us through cognitive warfare. It's fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to put this plan in the context of larger Kremlin's goals in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin has been clear in both word and action over the past 25 years that he seeks control over Ukraine, that it's never been about countering NATO only or about Ukraine's neutrality. It's, I think, important to remind that Ukraine was neutral before Russia has invaded originally. In 2014, Russia's campaign to regain control of Ukraine has progressed in increasingly extreme ways, starting from attempts to reintegrate Ukraine to Russia-dominated economic structures in early 2000, to then try to manipulate Ukraine's internal political structures, which failed in mid-2000, to then limited military intervention in 2014, which only allowed Russia to take control over Crimea, as well as portions of two of Ukraine's eastern regions, as opposed to Russia's initial objectives in 2014 to take control of vast majority of Ukraine's east and south. And I think many forget that Putin actually accepted less than his original aims in 2014. And then Russia used the next subsequent 8 years to try to manipulate both the West and Ukraine into voluntarily giving up Ukraine's sovereignty through versions of peace deals, which also did not work. And then Putin resorted to full-scale invasion in 2022, again, with the same intent to fully subjugate Ukraine. So control, not peace, remains the goal. And we see with the 28-point plan that this is another attempt to essentially accomplish Kremlin's objective, where I would bring in the cognitive warfare concept in this. Russia's cognitive warfare is not born out only of opportunity. It's also born out of need, because Kremlin's goals and means have a gap between them. Kremlin's capability is not sufficient to fulfill all the Kremlin's objectives, including in Ukraine. Like, we're 3.5 years into the war. Vladimir Putin has so far failed to achieve largely any of his stated military objectives in Ukraine, despite 1.2 million Russian casualties. So he's trying to close that gap through simply asserting premises in the cognitive space, and trying to have the West, essentially the world, simply accept those premises and then reason from them. And the chief example being of such premises that Russia simply deserves to have the regions of Ukraine it does not militarily occupy. And which would take years to conquer by force. So this is a prime example of cognitive warfare, of Russia trying to get something through cognitive effort that it cannot do through conventional capability alone.
Super interesting. And just to unpack even that one component of trying to take those parts of Ukraine without military force, like there's so many layers, I think, as you read about your piece on cognitive warfare. How would Russia achieve that beyond, like, obviously we see the peace plan now. What are some of the layers of cognitive warfare that have set that in motion at this point specifically?
Yeah, I think Western thinking on cognitive warfare often looks at it in too narrow a way from in my assessment. We're very focused on disinformation at the tactical level. But Russia's cognitive warfare is the entire set of capabilities and methods that shape our actions and our decision making. Essentially, I would say there are a number of ways in which Russia's cognitive warfare broader than we discuss it. The first one is that it's multi-generational. And Russian information operations, they span decades, and we don't think in terms of multi-generational information operations necessarily. So to your question, Russia has started to set information conditions that it then used in its initial military intervention in Ukraine in 2014, a decade prior. Russia's information operations that are all aimed to isolate Ukraine from its partners, be it United States or European partners, has hundreds of tactical level narratives that comprise efforts at the operational level of war that span countries and target very different set of individuals and decision makers. The larger effort that has been going on for years essentially aims to convince the West to stay on the sidelines, to choose inaction, or to choose delayed action. Russia benefits from both because fundamentally delayed action is what allows Russia to rebuild its capability, create offsets for the limits of its power. It was, I think, fractured initiative on the Western side is exactly what allowed Russia to reach out and build out relationships with China and North Korea and Iran to actually ramp up its defense industrial base in a pretty fundamental way. So the cognitive warfare effort is aimed essentially to make sure we do less so that Russia can do more. Going back to the original point, because the Kremlin still has very substantial gap between what it wants to accomplish and what its conventional force and capabilities can allow it to achieve.
Okay. Um, I'm interested in the multi-generational aspect. No doubt what you've described, like going back, 2.5 decades at some point, is clear. I'm curious as you look at Putin, does he think he's setting up a multi-generational process or he's extending it? Do we think he has that vision, or is he really just like in his lifetime, he's trying to accomplish some things?
Vladimir Putin has been very consistent in his strategic objectives for the last 2.5 decades. In fact, if you look back, and we've analyzed his speeches dating back to 1997 and published on that. He's been very consistent, both in word and action, in his objectives to subjugate Ukraine and Belarus, to reinstate control over larger areas of the former Soviet Union, to undermine US power, to fracture NATO, and to, most importantly, preserve his regime. Again, the way he has gone about it became increasingly extreme over time, but the intent has been consistent. And he has been proselytizing the set of narratives that accomplishes these objectives for the last, again, 2.5 decades. And Russian society, an entire generation has grew up in that frame. What I would mention is that Russian cognitive warfare goes beyond Vladimir Putin or Kremlin. It's much larger infrastructure and apparatus that spreads those narratives. And I'll make an example of a Russian information operation that targets the United States in particular and falsely accusing the United States of producing pathogens and biological weapons in biolabs in the former Soviet states. If we look back and analyze the path of that IO information operation, it has started at least in my assessment, maybe even earlier in 2008, Russia's invasion of Georgia. We observed it in at least a dozen of countries, including Georgia, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine. But it's not only former Soviet states. Russia's global information apparatus is pushing that IO against the United States in Africa, in Asia, in United States itself. And it serves two larger goals. The first one, it's actually serves a larger objective to help reestablish control of the former Soviet Union by creating negative perceptions of U.S. or other Western powers there. But second, it has nothing to do with that objective. It is also to broadly undermine the perception of U.S. Image and influence elsewhere in the world. And it is not Vladimir Putin who's pushing that information operation. It's many elements of Russia's cognitive warfare machine globally that are rejuvenating this narrative whenever it is also important for a certain physical activity. And we've seen that information operation be dormant for some time and then being reactivated to essentially support a particular campaign, like we've seen in Kazakhstan a couple of years ago when Russia deployed a limited military contingent to help Kazakh's government to essentially crack down on local protests.
Natalia, speaking about that theme, I mean, do you think that's a continuation or revival of Operation Infexia, which was using the same type of methodology and approach? You know, the United States was behind the creation of AIDS. It was using AIDS to undermine African countries, targeting the homosexual population in the United States to go after its own people, minority groups. You know, that they're using, you know, the CIA and U.S. military at Fort Detrick, that whole narrative, which was concocted by the Soviets, by Service A of the KGB and spread around the world using some kernels of fact. You know, we know that Fort Detrick exists, right? We know that there was a horrible epidemic that was going through the United States, which no one could figure out what it was originally, which turned out to be AIDS. The Soviets seized on, there was a lot of angst in the United States and certain communities about that illness and fear, and the Soviets used that, seized on it, and exploited it to undermine the United States around the world. So I would say it's a continuation of what happened in 2008 and the other examples that you're giving, you know, up until the using the excuse that we were creating biolabs in Ukraine, or just a continuation of that disinformation operation. Same theme.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it actually highlights a very important point that Russia's cognitive warfare today builds on both a lot of concepts from the Soviet Union as well as methods. And unlike Russia's military capability, which lapsed to a degree after the Soviet Union has collapsed, the discussion about reflexive control, which we'll talk about in a second, as well as just generally active measures and information operations has continued among Russia's military and intelligence services through the 90s. So did the active measures. So that capability has never lapsed. Vladimir Putin, however, relied on it heavily to both sustain his regime and to wage war. So he and the Kremlin invested very systematically in the cognitive warfare capabilities, especially after 2014, but even earlier. I think 2014 was the time when the national security paradigm in Russia, also at the doctrinal level, has started to reflect the notion that wars can be fought and won in an opponent's mind. But you're absolutely right that a lot of Russia's cognitive warfare today is fundamentally rooted in Soviet concepts and uses Soviet techniques with some adaptations.
If we, I want to get into reflexive control, but real quick, just to better understand the cognitive warfare levels of kind of tactical to strategic. If you take something like the biolab disinformation campaign, I feel like as I'm reading through your primer, that's kind of like what a lot of us in the West and the US will get hooked on as maybe a tactical level thing, as opposed to pulling ourselves up more to the operational strategic level. If that's tactical, and I guess I'm asking, is it tactical? What would be the operational strategic layers of that part of cognitive warfare?
Yeah, great question. A couple of things. So first, cognitive warfare at the tactical level is primarily aimed to shape perception of an event. It's about individual narratives. Efforts at the operational level go after an entire set of targets over a protracted period of time. At the strategic level, which is the hardest to grasp, but most important to understand. At that level, Russia is trying to shape the basis for how we reason. So we freely reason to the conclusions that benefit Russia. And that's fundamentally what reflexive control is. If we take biolab as an example, so the tactical level, once again, these are very discrete information operations in different countries that pop up periodically, timed to some other efforts that Russia is undertaking, be it in Ukraine, again, in Moldova. So very, very focused, discrete resurfacing of that narrative through social media, through local influencers. In Moldova, Russia used some Russia-friendly politicians several years ago to actually create petitions about shutting down those biolabs, which is also a way in which we can observe it at the tactical level. But the operational level, as you think about the totality of Russia's biolab operation across countries, it's a campaign that has a number of sub-narratives. Like, for example, biolabs, pathogens, bioweapons, biolabs, COVID-producing machines. And there are a number of others, iterations on the narratives, but at the operational level, it's the totality of that campaign across theaters and across different mediums. But if you then take it to the strategic level, it goes back to the question, like, what strategic objectives does it support? And in this case, there are two at minimum. Again, the first one is to create negative perception of the United States in the former Soviet states, as Russia has tried to regain control over those countries. But then second objective, unrelated, is to undermine U.S. influence globally, because we find traces of the biolab disinformation operation, again, in Africa, in Asia, and on the U.S. soil as well.
How about when we look at the sabotage incursions happening now further into Western Europe? You've got sabotage operations on the ground in Poland. You've got airspace activity from drones in a host of countries in Europe. You've got this vessel in UK waters that's somehow like trying to blind UK pilots. Plots about the UK and Ukraine working together with poison beer and different things. How do they fit into cognitive warfare, since we're reading about these weekly now?
I would mention two points. So first, physical actions also support Russia's cognitive warfare. So Russia uses physical actions such as sabotage, assassinations, military action to generate information effects. What we're observing in Europe right now, intensified attacks and malign acts against NATO, has two sets of objectives, in my assessment. The first one is short-term, and the second one is longer term. So the short-term one is to create information environment in which newly found momentum behind Europe's defense industrial base slows, and to make sure that its output never reaches Ukraine. So to increase pressure, essentially, in Europe domestically through these attacks, to trap whatever newly found dip momentum is in Europe, so it stays there, right? So that's purpose number one. And two, I think it's to keep Europe in a reactive stance and focus Europe on tactical sabotage and further away from developing long-term strategy to deal with the Russian threat. And I think the second, the long-term, it's potential condition. It's a condition setting in both psychological information for a potential conflict with NATO. Whether it happens or not, it is a condition setting phase. But yes, immediately it has a very clear, in my mind, information effects that it's trying to achieve relating to Europe's defense industrial base and momentum behind it.
Well, I have an extra question for you, Natalia. How do you see the Russians, or do you see the Russians, I should ask it like this, trying to use these types of operations to also send the message to the Europeans that the United States is not going to come to your aid? The United States is decoupling from Europe, because this is one theme I think has been being pushed for years now, to try and drive a wedge between the U.S. and other members of NATO. So using operations that are below the threshold of, tripping Article 5 or getting the U.S. to take military action. Do you see that? I mean, obviously I do, but what's your assessment? Is this part of what the Russians are trying to do in their disinformation operations and their cognitive warfare?
Yeah, I think the Kremlin assesses a number of critical vulnerabilities in Europe. The first one is, of course, the friction points that exist within the alliance and its different members with the US, but not only. The second, I would say, different level of mental thresholds that exist within European countries in terms of their perception and readiness for the war, and also understanding of the Russian threat. And that is one of the things that I'm concerned the most about, because once again, if we think about mental thresholds, Russia is a country that has normalized over 1.2 million casualties. If you look at Ukraine, we have days where Ukraine is subjected to combined drone and missile attacks that have hundreds of strikes in them on one city a night. So that's the mental threshold. And then you have European countries that have been in a relatively peaceful state for quite some time. And Russia understands very well in my assessment, assesses that as a critical vulnerability within Europe, the different mental threshold and readiness to the war. So right now, in my assessment, there is an opportunity actually for Europe, for NATO, for US to seize the initiative away from Russia and Europe at the relatively low cost, because we're talking still relatively low scale of attacks. We're also talking about Russia being tied up in Ukraine, both in terms of capability and decision-making and focus. And also a lot of Russian operatives have been kicked out of Europe after 2022 and before. So it relies on its gig economy to conduct a lot of this sabotage activity. It's vulnerable in that way. So now there's still opportunity to counter that at a relatively low cost and risk versus what Europe can face when Russia can increase those attacks exponentially if it turns more of its attention to Europe, which will only further, in my assessment, drive Europe into a reactive stance and further away from coherent strategy on Russia.
Love these points. I want to ask how you see defending against cognitive warfare and maybe going on the offense, as you just wrote about in the past few days. I would assume this 28-point plan, although it has a few things that sound good for Ukraine, largely is very in favor of what Russia's been asking for all along. I would assume this would not be part of how you defend against cognitive warfare.
Yeah. And look, I think two things in this regard. So first, yes, it's a core Russian capability. It is effective. Russia successfully has used it to shape Western decision-making on Ukraine, to mask its weaknesses, to preserve Putin's regime. It's a model for China and Iran. And I would argue that at this point, Russia does have initiative in the cognitive domain. And these are all the reasons we should care about this capability and think about how to defend against it and defeat it. On the other side, I would say that, first of all, Russia's cognitive warfare is effective, but only to a point. And in my assessment, the United States has all the capability it needs to both defend against Russia's cognitive warfare and defeat it. But I think it requires a number of shifts in how we approach the issue. So I think the first one, we really should not be trying to tackle it symmetrically and focus less on reacting to disinformation at the tactical level and really go after the level of strategic reasoning and try to dismantle the very premises that Russia is trying to establish. Like, for example, that it simply deserves areas of Ukraine that it doesn't even occupy, or that Russia simply deserves its sphere of influence. That is not a fact. That is an assertion that Russia is trying to essentially convince everyone of, but that's not necessarily a reality. And we've actually seen, and Glenn can talk at depth about it, many countries in the former Soviet Union essentially trying to move away from Russia's grip. We see a lot of friction in, obviously, Russia faced a major setback in Moldova in September, having invested tremendous resources into try to sway those elections, but the pro-European party won decisively. We see friction points in Armenia, in Kazakhstan, and a number of other areas. So dismantling the premise that Russia simply deserves a sphere of influence is the right level to tackle Russia's cognitive warfare, instead of trying to spend a lot of resources chasing after individual disinformation, misinformation narratives. I think that's one. And the second thing I will mention, as for understanding battle space and battlefield, we have a notion of common operating picture. I think we absolutely need to have one for the cognitive warfare.
Mhm.
And I think it's possible to have one because vast majority of Russia's cognitive warfare efforts support a very limited set of objectives. And it is possible to understand which narratives support which objectives. That's what making them predictable. And if it's predictable, then we can target it. But we need this kind of common of operating picture to know what narratives Russia is pushing, where it's advancing, where it's facing setbacks. Because once again, cognitive warfare efforts sometimes fail, sometimes they backfire, sometimes they have other limitations. So having that cognitive warfare cop, if you will, I think can enable us not only predict them, but preempt them and target them. And then we can think about going on offensive once we have that baseline.
Ryan, what's interesting is the timing of all this. And we talk about going on the offensive and Nataliya's points about, recognizing Russia's sphere of influence, or its demand that it has a sphere of influence that we must recognize, which if you go back to the 90s, we had the Russia First policy, which Nataliya, I'm sure, remembers, which I think was ridiculous, where we were saying that Russia had priority or a sphere of influence in the former Soviet space, Central Asia, the Caucasus, which I think was not a good idea on our part. Now we see, in many ways, the president and the administration is taking initiative that hadn't been taken before or hadn't been taken boldly before. So Nataliya refers to Armenia, Azerbaijan, the trip, having President Aliyev and the Armenian Prime Minister Pashinyan in the White House, in the Oval Office together. When most people see that, maybe Europeans say, they say, oh, that's good. That's an effort towards peace. When Putin sees that, I'm sure his blood boils because he sees those as his vassals, right? When he brings the C5+1, which we talked about recently on a podcast, when he brings the Central Asian leaders to Washington and holds a summit with them, I'm sure his blood boils. Those are very good initiatives. In Syria, talking about building a U.S. air base outside of Damascus, the Russians see that as their sphere of influence, and I'm sure it makes Putin's blood boil. To Nataliya's point, he can't do anything much about it right now, right? President Putin, because he's exhausted himself in Ukraine with his disastrous war, and the Ukrainians have made him exhaust himself by fighting so valiantly and effectively against the Russian armed forces, right? So we have an opportunity now, and I was referring to Nataliya's article, which is a great article. So we are kind of on the offensive. We just, in my opinion, need to organize it a little bit better, promote it and market it a little bit better.
Yeah.
And explain what's going on. And then just, my experience, you talk about how do you defend about cognitive warfare. One thing is don't panic, right? I think what I'm seeing now with this discussion of what's happening, on the 28-point plan, I see a lot of panic. I see a lot of emotion. I saw that in 2016 after the elections, a lot of emotion where we needed to be a little bit more objective and cold-blooded or calm in studying what the problem is and how do you respond to the problem. Because when you panic and you overreact, you play into the hands of the Kremlin and this machine that they've created to manipulate our responses. That's number one. Number two, you have to study the facts. Don't listen to just, this piece of information. You really got to dig into the facts, because I think one reason that the cognitive warfare is working very effectively now is because Americans aren't thinking critically, right? You got to think critically about a lot of the stuff that's out there in the media. We need more trust in the media. And then I would say we should probably go back to, the Russians are going back to the old Soviet model, Soviet examples. In some cases, it goes back further to Tsarist times when the disinformation machine was created by the Okhrana. What we need to do is look at our examples of when things worked. And during the Reagan administration, they finally figured out how to build a capability to identify and counter Soviet disinformation. To my knowledge, we have not done that effectively since the late 80s or early 90s, when that capability was disbanded at the end of the Cold War. And we should probably study that and try and rebuild that capability, which was an interagency U.S. government capability that effectively identified and then countered with facts. And to have those facts, or to have that counter, you have to have objective reporting, media coverage that dispels the falsehoods and the disinformation that the Russians are putting out. I think, if you go back and look at that period, as Americans, we should have been very proud of what the Reagan administration did in this space. and it was effective. Unfortunately, it was disbanded, and to my knowledge, it was never rebuilt. And I should say, too, I have to say this because, to a point Natalia is making, this effort against the United States started long before 2014. It started actually when Putin came to power. If you were in Central Asia or the Caucasus, the Russians were conducting a lot of disinformation operations aimed at undermining the United States in our interests. And then it expanded, in my assessment, into the Middle East, other parts of the world, when they saw that there was no pushback. And we were almost naive. We seemed naive or lacked the will to respond to their disinformation. And now we have this on our hands.
Natalia, how long do you think Russia could hold out in this war going forward? Are they in a position where we could, if there's no peace plan that happens and you have sustained fighting, another year from now, could you see this same level of casualties being absorbed by Russia?
It will depend in large part on on U.S. strategy and the rate of European defense industrial base resurgence, and whether it's directed toward two things. One, helping Ukraine inflict substantial battlefield setbacks on Russia, and two, to contest Russia's initiative elsewhere. And this goes back to the piece we just published. In my assessment, as long as Russia perceives initiative on the ground in Ukraine, even if it's through these very creepy and very costly offensive operations, as long as it perceives initiative in the global information space, as long as it's perceived initiative in Europe, which right now it arguably has with the intensifying attacks, it has very little incentive to stop. But that said, and we've discussed it with Glenn earlier, Russia is very vulnerable to sustained pressure. It is one of the things it's truly vulnerable to. And we've seen actually very recently an example of that where on one side, increasing success and effectiveness of Ukraine's long-range strikes against Russia's energy, combined with U.S. policy against key Russian energy enterprises, have started to have cumulative effect on that industry in Russia, amounting to shortages, generating internal conversation and complaints about that. And I would say casting doubt on reliability of one of the key levers of Russia's power globally. And I think it's one of the reasons why the plan surfaced now. It's, in my assessment, one of the attempts likely to break this kind of effects that Ukraine, with U.S. help and U.S. through its economic policy, started to generate. So I think it's a huge variable of sustained pressure or not, because that will determine the rate of Russian reconstitution. It will also determine the rate of how effectively it can use its help from China and other partners to surge its capability further and to innovate further. Like 2 years ago, we were not in a place where Russia can mass produce Shahed-type drones and launch these kinds of attacks on Ukraine. And by the way, Shaheds are not only Ukraine's problem. That is a capability of all three U.S. adversaries, with Russia providing imagination space for the kind of effects it can achieve. So I think it will depend on our strategy. And I think that's one thing we should not forget, that the combined power of the alliance, economic and beyond, dwarfs Russia. If you combine the GDPs of NATO states and U.S. NATO European and Asian allies, it's over 60 trillion, and Russia's GDP is around 2 trillion. So if we surge, Russia not only will not be able to advance, it's very likely it will lose and can suffer a defeat in its objectives. So the cognitive warfare effort is always, Russia's cognitive warfare effort is always going to prioritize making sure we never think in terms of initiative and proactive posturing. Going back to Glenn's excellent point on reactiveness, Russia's reflexive control fundamentally depends on someone else's reflex. So we need to get out of this reactive stance and think in terms of what objectives are we trying to achieve with regard to Russia and Ukraine, but also globally, and build from there.
Looking at this issue a little bit, or from the opposite side, you travel to Ukraine quite a bit. You have a lot of contacts there. How long can the Ukrainians sustain this fight? And in your assessment as an American, how long can we sustain this fight? I have my view, but I'd like to hear your view. And then I want to share my view, if that's okay, Ryan.
Yeah, please.
And I want to hear your view, Ryan.
Ryan, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, why don't we
My
start?
gosh. Yeah, let's start with me. This 28-point plan makes my blood boil, just to start out there. As I look at Russia's economy and how many people they're losing, I probably naively have hope that there's something that could break the back of the will there and force some type of a stop with Putin's aggression. But if we're talking about Ukraine, I do hope that we, as the US, continue to support them and probably support them even more, that Europe continues to support them, and that we extend this and force Russia to bleed out in this battle. I use that term a lot. I don't use it lightly, having been in different wars. We saw it work in the past with Afghanistan. We didn't have to become decisively engaged in the 80s there. We had some support that went in. I would love to see us do something similar where Russia is not able to reconstitute, which I assume they would do as soon as a ceasefire happens. They would rebuild. I would like to believe they wouldn't advance further in Ukraine, but I don't believe that. I think a lot of what they're doing in Western Europe is probably laying the groundwork from a cognitive standpoint for something that's going to happen later. Right now, having a stronger Russia in a year or two, if there were a ceasefire now with China's growth, I think is not in our best interest either. So I just overall, I'm pessimistic with this plan, and I hope that we would continue to support Ukraine probably even more than we're doing right now. Natalia, love to hear your take.
I think the question of Ukraine's resilience in this fight depends on a couple of variables. So the first one is Russia's intent, and the way that Russia, the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin have framed this war. It is an existential fight, and it remains an existential fight. And that's one of the reasons why Ukrainians keep fighting, because the choice is not between a good and a bad peace, it's between fighting, and Russia's occupation essentially amounts to forced mobilization, judicial killings, deportation, all the things we know that are happening on the occupied territories. And by the way, any territory that Russia keeps, it will forcefully mobilize its population into fighting, essentially, future wars, as we've seen both in Ukraine and its efforts to do so in other areas that it occupies. So there's a fundamental driver here of Russia's intent that doesn't leave much room for maneuver in Ukraine. And I think one of the Russia's big cognitive warfare efforts has been to equate the notion of peace to surrender and really try to wrap the surrender terms in concept of peace and play on a very right instinct in the West always to try to stop the fighting, stop the killing. But the issue is that stopping the fighting in this case does not necessarily stop the killing, because the killing can still continue in Russia's torture chambers on the occupied territories, and Ukrainians know very well. So like that bounds what the realm of possible. In terms of sheer capability, I think the two things that truly matter, one is Ukraine's defense industrial potential, and Ukraine has ramped up its dip from low digits a few years ago to now estimated capacity of around 30 billion, at least according to latest estimates of Ukrainian government. So U.S. and largely Western investment and recognition of Ukraine's defense industrial base as an asset and how much that collaboration will continue, I think is a huge variable in Ukraine's. To your question of how long can Ukraine sustain, right now Ukraine is starting to produce additional capabilities such as Flamingo with enough precision and enough payload to affect more on the battlefield. So I think that's an area to watch. And lastly, of course, the question of US and Western support has a huge impact on Ukraine's planning, morale, but it's not the only factor, once again, because of the fundamental existential nature of the war. But all three, in my assessment, all three variables are the core and what's shaping the longevity and ability to sustain this fight for Ukraine.
All right, Glenn, you wrap us up here.
Well, I just think that there are three talking points that I see coming from the Kremlin, which we have to be very aware of and understand why they're being made. One, trying to convince people that Russia can fight forever. The Russians they have incredible stamina. The West can't last as long as the Russians can. The Ukrainians can't. What I've seen from the Ukrainians on my trips to Ukraine and the people I speak with regularly is the Ukrainians are not surrendering. They will continue to fight. As one commander told me recently, he said, I don't care if we have no ammunition, we'll fight with sticks, because the alternative is to be subjugated to the Russian rule again, and we'll never do that again, because it's going to be death either way for us. Death culturally, death spiritually or death on the battlefield. And knowing the Ukrainians and what we've seen, they'd rather die on the battlefield and kill a lot of Russians before they do, right? So that's one point. And the Russians, by the way, historically have collapsed. Russia is not a country that can go forever and in an abusive manner towards its own people and economy and survive. We can look at the example of World War I as one small example of what happened to our empire when the government mismanaged it. And then, of course, we have 1991 and what happened at the end of the Soviet Union. There are other examples as well. So that narrative that the Russians put out is a false narrative, in my opinion. That the U.S. can benefit financially. There are deals to be made with Russia. Just bring this thing to an end. People are going to profit from it. There's going to be, rare earth minerals, oil deals, gas deals. Anybody that's thinking about that should go talk to people that tried to do business in Russia in the 90s, see what happened to them, how many people got fleeced. I would say that there may be potential in Russia, but it's not going to be for a long time. And as long as this regime is not in power, that's my personal assessment. And I would never want to do business in a country that treats its neighbors the way that Russia is treating its neighbors now. So that's number two. And then the third point is that and I think this is a very important point, many Americans I speak with say, yeah, this is terrible what's happening, but the real problem is China. The PRC is the real threat. We need to shift everything and focus on the PRC. And if we make a deal with Russia, they'll join us and they'll counter the Chinese with us. I think that's naive. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think there's any signs that will happen. I think one, if we undermine Russia now and we help the Ukrainians finish this war in a way that is beneficial to Ukraine and fair to Ukraine, that will actually deter the PRC from taking actions against other countries. That's number one. Number two, it's going to hurt the PRC because they've invested a lot in Russia and they're not getting much of their return, especially if the Russian economy keeps going the way it's going, because the PRC doesn't have the money to buy up Russia like some people think it's doing or can. And then the third point I would say is the Russians themselves. There are many Russians that are not happy with China's influence in Russia, but this current regime has shown no indication that they're going to really, in a sincere manner, be our allies. I think it's naive when people think that we can just flip Putin and the people around him to be American allies. I don't think that's realistic. And so if we're counting on them to join us in some, alliance against the People's Republic of China, I think we're betting on the wrong horse. There are better ways to tackle that problem. I do agree that PRC is a problem that needs to be focused on and needs attention. But to do that, and I agree with Nataliya, we need to focus on Russia, Iran, China together. This is a combined threat to the United States and our interests and our values. And I want to go back to what you always say when we start, loving people. It's a threat to people that love their freedom. Look at any of those regimes and how they treat their citizens. And none of us should want our children to grow up in a country where we have a regime that treats its children that way, its citizens that way. And none of us should want any country to have to live in those conditions. And if we can help the Ukrainians to protect themselves in the future, I think we need to do it. It's not because I love Ukraine. I tell the Ukrainians this all the time. I love the United States and I love the country I grew up in, I was raised in, and the values that we had. So we got to keep defending those values. The Ukrainians are doing that for us in many ways and with us, and we got to keep doing it together. I don't think we're going to survive if we abandon them now. My personal opinion.
Nataliya, thank you so much for taking time with us. I know it can't be easy hanging around Glenn as much as you do. We're so glad you took the time. Where can people find you online? Obviously, we'll have links to your writing on ISW. Any other place you'd tell people to look for you online?
LinkedIn and X, I would say, are the two platforms.
Perfect. Thanks so much for the time, Nataliya.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening and being a part of the RH community. Would you like to receive the same daily intel brief that Glenn and I read? You can get it for free at restrictedhandling.com. We've curated what we consider to be the most relevant and reputable sources on all things international security, geopolitics, military and intel ops, and economics and sanctions, focused exclusively on Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and the Middle East, to include accompanying podcasts for Russia, China, economics, and spy stories. Just head to restrictedhandling.com, enter your email, and you'll get the daily briefs that Glenn and I both read, and you can leave comments and questions that we can respond to. Thanks again for listening. Stay safe.